Okay, good morning. As he mentioned, I'm Sunny. For those of you that don't know me, I've been working the last 2 or 3 years, I think now, with Neil Hammerschmidt. I used to be the Assistant Director for Colorado, now on cattle health staff, but I'm the ADT liaison. So Neil and I work pretty closely together. For today's presentation, I'm going to give a little bit of a report on the assessment that we released this week. The parameters that we looked at for that assessment included the trace performance measures, so I'll give an update on those. We did look at actual program trace data as well for that assessment. And then we'll talk a little bit about the successes and challenges that we delineated in conducting that assessment. We'll also go over next steps, priorities, and what the outreach will look like in the ADT regional meetings that we have coming up. So just a couple basic slides. I know a lot of you have seen this in the past, but when talking about the ADT framework, it's important to keep in mind that we developed this as a flexible system. We wanted to incorporate the strengths of the states, the tribes, and producers, and keep it flexible, rely on things that we knew worked. And so the use of basic low-cost technology was important in that, what we've used in our disease eradication programs. However, as you know, APHIS does focus on supporting advanced technologies, so we've done some projects with RFID in the past, including the ultra-high frequency projects that we did most recently. And it was set up as a basic bookend system, so we know we can trace back from slaughter, but we set up the parameter of the initial step of where the animal is officially identified. So basic bookend system. Also incorporate interstate certificates of veterinary inspection or movement documentation in that, so we have a little bit more pieces of the puzzle, but definitely not full traceability, a basic bookend system. If you look at the rule, you know that it covers most of the livestock species. The focus is on cattle and bison, however, because a lot of the other species are covered under other regulations. And for the purposes of this assessment, we focused only on cattle and bison. So a reminder of the general requirements. Basic concept of the ADT framework is livestock that move interstate must be, unless exempt, officially identified and move with a movement document, ICVI, or other acceptable movement documentation. So this is the cover of the assessment report. It was released, I think, Monday. The announcement came out that we finalized it, and it's been posted on the ADT website. When the rule was originally published in 2013, the intent was that feeder cattle were excluded from that rule, and any requirements or enhancements to ADT would be made after an assessment was conducted to see how we were doing under the original framework. I know you've seen this slide before, and I think this is one of Neil's favorites, because when we look at the success of the program in its current framework, I think we can all agree that one of the most valuable things that's come out of this is the availability of records. So anytime we can get away from sorting through boxes, and this is Colorado's, Neil always gives credit to Colorado for showing us a year of their CVI file as important export, but anytime we can get away from pawing through boxes of paper and entering a tag in a database and finding that in seconds after you log in, that's advancement. And so when we look at the administration of tags and being able to find ICVI documentation more easily or readily, the key to ADT is being able to find that information quickly and finding accurate information. So we've talked about the traceability performance measures quite a bit in the past, and so ADT was set up as a performance-based system. It was developed in 2010 by the State Federal Working Group that had input into the rule. And so basically every year we conduct these trace performance exercises, and the primary focus is the basics of the rule, so administration of official ID and interstate movement documentation. And what we focus on is documenting progress and identifying weaknesses within the state's traceability systems, with an eye then on how can we make improvement to that system to show progress every year within traceability. So the national baseline parameters were set up at the beginning of the publication of the rules, so back in 2013. The first comparison that we talk about are records that were based in 2012 through 2014, and the second year comparison covers records from 2013 through 2015. And so for the next couple slides, we're going to go over the comparisons for those first 2 years against the national baseline. Two key factors that are measured for each trace performance measure include the elapsed time, so the time it takes you to find the information that we're looking for related to a trace, and then the percent successfully completed, so how often do you find the information needed to conduct a trace. The next couple slides cover the 4 activities measured with the trace performance measures, and the working group set these up because these are the most easily measured regardless of the complexity of the trace. So I know you guys have seen these slides before in relation to what they cover, but I think there's always a little bit of confusion as to what the activities are, so we'll just go through these and talk about the values that were obtained between the first and second year comparisons. So number 1, in what state was an imported animal officially identified? So this actually measures, doesn't actually measure the state's capabilities for distribution records, but rather 840 animal identification numbers captured within the Animal Identification Management System, or the AIMS system. And so only 840 numbers can be used for this trace, so you're looking at, if you're in Nebraska, you're looking at what state was the 840 tag applied in. And so if you look at the national baseline, we didn't have enough records for that. Not much of an issue because, again, it doesn't measure the state's capabilities, but rather our system. So in the first comparison, we could see that we were successful 87% of the time. Took 39 hours to complete, to successfully complete those for the elapsed time. If you look at the second year comparison, you can see we had a huge increase in the percent successfully completed. Kind of what we would expect. You know, distribution records come from the tag manufacturers and then also the states that may have applied them, so that system should be fairly complete. I would expect that to be a high percentage of successfully completed, and I would expect the time to be fairly low. So we had a pretty good time at 39 hours, but we saw that it significantly decreased to 20 hours in the second year comparison. For number 2, where in your state was the animal officially identified? So this jumps to the state's record-keeping system of tags distributed to and administered to producers, accredited veterinarians, markets. And so where in the state, the physical location where was the animal tagged. So if the animal was tagged at a market, we asked the states to go back to the consignor and figure out the location where the animal was actually tagged, not just at the market. So if you look at the national baseline, only 69% successful, so fairly low if you think about it, and 88 hours to determine the elapsed time to determine where that animal was tagged. First year comparison, we jump up to 88% completion, so significant increase, and decrease to 35 hours of elapsed time, so significant improvement in the time it takes to find that information. In the second year comparison, we maintain at 87%, so not the increase we would have liked to have seen in percent successful, but still maintaining. But again, a decrease to 29 hours for elapsed time, so pretty good time frame for being able to find those records on tag distribution and application. Number 3, from what state was an animal shipped? So again, you're in Nebraska, you're looking at what state the animal shipped from that was imported into your state. So national baseline values, 58% successful, so not very successful, 138 hours to find that information, so pretty significant time frame. For the first year comparison, we jump up to 84% successful, so very significant increase in the amount of records that were able to be located, and a decrease to 42 hours for the elapsed time. That's very significant. That's a huge improvement over the national baseline. And then again, we see just a slight increase in percent successfully located, but again, a significant decrease to 32 hours for elapsed time. So definitely making improvement in those ICVIs and being able to locate the information. And then finally, from what location in your state was an exported animal shipped? And so you're looking at any animal exported out of your state on an ICVI. And so again, sorry, I'm getting myself confused. So for national baseline, 76% successfully completed. It's not terrible, but still a little lower than we would like, but 264 hours to find that information, a lot longer than we would like to have. For the first year comparison, we jump up to 88% successfully completed, so huge improvement, and down to 46 hours elapsed time. So just within that first year, those records became that much more readily available, and the time decreased that much. So I think that's a pretty notable achievement. And then again, dropped a little bit more to 41 hours for elapsed time and up to 91% for successfully completed. So we're making progress. The incremental increase in successfully completed, getting there slowly but surely, but the elapsed time has really substantially decreased, which is good to see, and a lot better than pawing through boxes to look for those official identification numbers. Again, anything we can do to maximize the electronic systems. I guess I can't scroll down on my notes. Anything we can do to increase the use of electronic systems is going to benefit us with the percent successfully completed and the decrease in elapsed time. So as we go through these TPMs, I think we're going to see maintenance or maybe, slight plateauing of these numbers, because we're at a point in time where most of it is data entry as opposed to truly electronic records. So we have some states that have the ability to make, we have some states that have the ability to make significant improvement as they move their systems to more truly electronic data. So that'll only be seen with, further cooperative agreement periods, more money spent towards those electronic systems versus data entry. Here we have another parameter that we used in conducting the assessment, and these are tuberculosis traces from animals slaughtered from 2010 through ended fiscal year 2016. And this was data that had initially been compiled by Kathy Orlowski and some other folks with SIA. So we used the same parameters that she did in her initial assessment, but we put even years on either side of the publication of the rules. So we looked at data from 3 years before the publication and then 3 years after the publication for whether animals had ID when they were confirmed at slaughter with tuberculosis. And so if you look at the slide, in the left-hand column you can see the type of identification they had, if any. Across the top you can see if they were successfully traced or not. And so we'll just go through some of the parameters, the results from this slide. And so we had 38 total confirmed cases of TB. 18 of those cases were in adults and 20 cases were in fed cattle. There were 26 animals that were successfully traced in this time period, 21 with any ID, so unofficial or official ID, and 5 with no ID. Of the 14 with no ID, 5 were traced due to available slaughter records, so the records were good enough. We didn't need ID in those cases. 5 were indirect, and that means we got lucky because they had a cohort they were slaughtered with that had official ID or some type of ID where we were able to trace that animal back to the herd of origin, and 4 were untraceable. And so when you look at this data and when we analyzed it statistically, there's a significant difference at the 95% confidence interval, P less than 0.02, than an animal with official ID is successfully traced versus those animals with no ID. So it definitely is a benefit, and especially when it's matched appropriately, as we know, for that animal to have official ID at slaughter and get us back to the herd of origin. We also took a look at compliance and enforcement related to the traceability regulation. I know this is kind of a busy slide, but I just wanted to give you a general look at the numbers. And so what we have here are unofficial, basically educational actions taken, and then enforcement actions taken. So consultation and letters of information are basically educational ways of trying to enforce compliance. Cases, as you might know, cases initiated with IES are more of stringent enforcement actions that we can take with through APHIS. So this measures 2014 and 2015 compliance and enforcement actions. Dealers and markets for 2014 were grouped together. We split those out for 2015, so that explains the differences in those columns. The other thing that we added in 2015 were any trace regulations outside or requirements outside of Part 86. So that's why you see that additional line for 2015 down at the bottom. And what I think it's important to note here is you can see, and again, the first year after the rule was published, we really focused on education. There's a lot of material to cover in that rule, so trying to get people to understand what the requirements were, what the exemptions are, that sort of thing. So we really stressed to our employees, don't, lay off on the letters of information, letters of warning. We don't want to initiate any cases with IES. This is strictly an educational period to make sure that producers and industry understands what we're asking of them. So we started measuring in 2014, and you can see we have a fair number of consultations for both years, 14 and 15, almost 3,000 in 14. We maintain a fair amount of letters of information, so those might have been the second action that someone would take. So you have a consultation, you're not following the rule, you didn't ID these animals, they needed to be ID'd, or they needed to move with a letter, with an ICVI. The second step would be a letter of information. We talked about this a couple times. You're still not doing it. There's consequences if you don't follow the rule, that sort of thing. You can then move to a letter of warning, which is more official with IES, or an actual case if it's an egregious enough a violation where they might receive a stipulation or fine related with their violation. But as you can see, for both 2014 and 2015, the number of cases actually initiated, not found to be violations necessarily, with IES have been fairly low, so 50 and 74% respectively. And so I think that shows that we're really trying to make sure people are educated on it. I think for the most part people try to comply with the regulations, but as you know, with the exemptions it can be fairly confusing. So I think a lot of times it's just a matter of consulting with the individuals to make sure that they understand when they do and don't need ID and when it needs to be recorded on an ICVI. And just to give you a few more tidbits of information, so we did go ahead and take a look at the number of IES investigations that actually resulted in violations since the publication of the rule. So there were 23 cases with IES that actually resulted in confirmed violations of 9 CFR. The penalties assessed included 38 separate official warnings, so the APHIS 7060, which is the official letter of warning under IES's parameters. And basically the reason there's more letters of warnings than cases is because you might have 3 or 4 individuals associated with an individual case, so a producer, a market, a dealer, that sort of thing. So just explain some of the increase in the letters versus the number of cases. There were 6 monetary fines or stipulations out of those cases, ranging from $313 to $6,250 per fine. And just as you would expect, it covered, the gamut through the rules. So no official identification, no CVI when they needed one. Surprisingly, only 1 case of tags being removed from an animal. So I thought that was interesting. I kind of expected to see a little bit more of that. And then also failure to list official identification on an ICVI when it needed to be listed. So how are we doing? So if you look at ADT in the context of the rule, the flexibility of the framework with which it was set up, we think we're doing pretty well. We have increased number of records electronically readily available, searchable, so of official ID and also the movement documentation. We have those records more readily than we ever did in the past based on what we've required under the rule. But I don't think anybody would disagree that significant gaps still exist in the rule. So we'll cover those next. Based on the conversations that we've had with individuals over time since the rule has been published, and with our next step calls that we've had with state veterinarians and with our own employees, we think that our most significant challenge related to the framework, the way it's set up today, is that official identification requirements are limited to interstate movements. And when you consider that an animal can move multiple times within state, not have any requirements for official ID or movement documentation, there's significant chance for disease to spread. And when you go to look for records, they might not have needed it. You know, there's no record of official, tagging, so that doesn't exist. And then movement documentation may not exist depending on how they moved. And we've all seen those examples of how do you trace the one black animal out of a group with no identification and no documentation. I've heard many times, and somebody laughed at me when the rule was first published, and I said I had to read it 10 times before I understood it. But when you go through it and you say, okay, everything needs official identification that moves interstate, but not this animal. And so you have to go through it multiple times till you get the caveats and the exemptions that exist in the rule. So did it move intrastate only? Did it move interstate? Did it move with an official ID? Does it need an official ID or a back tag? Does it need a movement document? Will somebody accept something other than a movement document? Does it need to be listed on the movement document? So we can understand if we have confusion going through it and trying to remember what needs what, how do we expect our industry to do any better? Especially, I think it's been challenging at the markets. We've heard that over and over again, especially if someone says, oh, nope, this animal's going direct to slaughter, it doesn't move anything, it doesn't need anything. How do you enforce compliance unless you're sitting at the other end waiting for that animal to show up at the slaughter plant? So it makes monitoring and compliance efforts really challenging, and it's just hard for industry, I think, to understand in general. The flexibility that we gave and our reliance on low-cost visual-only technology worked really well for our programs in the past. There's no denying it. It still works. Having that tag is hugely beneficial no matter what, but I think we've all agreed that trying to do these things at the speed of commerce and the reliance on having to data enter those IDs, or for the accredited vets to have to handwrite them on ICVIs, is just not practical. So I'm at a point now where I need reading glasses for small print. I'm not too bad just yet, but I can really appreciate the magnifying glass for looking at a news tag and trying to read the numbers. And when you talk about trying to transcribe those numbers onto an ICVI, this is one of our favorite pictures as well. This always gets gasps from people that have never seen something like that before. But trying to find the one number on that ICVI when it looks like that, and the frustration that this accredited vet truly felt when creating this ICVI, I think is pretty evident. So having to do that transcription may mean that the animal is handled multiple times, but then also how do you read this? Is it legible? I think a lot of you who have conducted TPMs on an incorrectly transposed news tag or AIN tag have felt the frustration of trying to do that when somebody just wrote it down wrong, but we didn't realize it at the time. So even though that technology has worked really well, we're definitely feeling the limitations of it now. I've heard this question multiple times. So phase 2, you're going to require identification and movement documentation for feeder cattle. I think all of us would agree that this is probably not the primary issue that we have right now with the current framework. We do think it's important. They're not exempt from diseases. As you saw with the TB slaughter cases, 20 of those cases out of 38 were in feeder cattle. So it's definitely something that we need to consider, but we think there's other challenges that exist at this point in time. And again, until we move to a more speed of commerce system, whether that means RFID or however we achieve that, listing them on official documentation is not going to happen until we have electronic systems and capabilities. We've all heard about the trade implications too, and people sit on both sides of the fence with this one. Everybody is impacted by trade. So we hear producers say, I don't trade, I don't care. Okay, but trade affects you. And one of the things we've heard repeatedly from China, initially when they came over, they said, you know, we just want the exported animals to be able to get back to the birth herd. As long as we have the information for the birth herd, we're set. That's all we need. When they came over, they repeatedly asked, well, how do you regulate movement from the birth herd? How do you get back to the birth herd? So it was very clear, even though we don't have set requirements from them yet, that they're very interested in our domestic traceability system. They want us to have full traceability. So we'll see what the requirements end up being in the end, but I think that's going to become increasingly important for our trading partners that we have full traceability. You've probably heard that we have a slaughter plant working group. We know that there are huge challenges at the slaughter plants in relation to not only collecting ID, but then being able to correlate that ID appropriately to the carcass through final disposition. Something that we're desperately working to improve. I think we're making good strides. We've got FSIS at the table now, working on training, education for not only their personnel, but also our personnel for going into the plant and being able to detect if there's an issue, see where the process might fail, and work with them on solutions of how to make sure that it's correlated appropriately. We also have a database now that will help us monitor the submissions from the plants in terms of making sure we're getting, you know, the appropriate number of official IDs. Even if it's fed animals, if we get hundreds and hundreds of submissions with no ID, we know that's probably not accurate. So we can target, you know, plants that might not be doing their job a little bit better. We found in our discussions with our field personnel, we did the top 40 adult plants and the top 22 fed plants, and we found that in our discussions with these requirements are inconsistently applied due to a couple different factors. Some plants will say they can't collect at the speed of commerce. I would argue that a little bit. You know, they say they can't slow the line down. It might depend on the type of plan, and maybe the plan is a little bit outdated because we have really large plants with high volume that are able to do it successfully. They collect all the ID with no problem, and then we have small plants that say they can't possibly do it. It's not going to work for them. So trying to figure out what the differences are between those and troubleshoot a little bit to try to help them collect them a little bit better. Maybe if they truly can't collect all ID, what do we want them to focus on? Official ID, back tags, what, you know, trying to educate them a little bit better on what we're looking for. Procedural issues at plants. We've heard people say, I didn't even know I had to do this, which blows my mind, but that has happened. And we think that that's partially due to turnover between the plant personnel and also FSIS. We know they have shortages as well. So that's why it's even more important for our personnel to get in there and be providing that consistent message over and over again. And that'll help us with the compliance, you know, in the rule in general too, by getting our personnel in there to talk to plant personnel and FSIS consistently. So next steps, I know everybody's keenly interested in what's going to happen over the next few weeks. We're starting the discussion on the ADT framework, including what's working well, what we think is working well. We want to hear what you think is working well. Again, reiterate what the gaps might be, hear that from producers and industry. Do we want to do revisions to the current framework? Do we think that there's things that we could tweak just a little bit to get us advancement in our current system? And what are our long-term objectives? What do we want to achieve? Do we want to achieve full traceability? Do we want a time frame for that? Do we just want to get to this level? So just working with everyone to determine what's most important. We've already done the conference calls with the state animal health officials and our personnel, so those started, I think, back in November and December. We had 2 initial calls and then set up district calls with the states and with our district folks to kind of work through some of these things. We wanted to make sure, it's clear on the larger calls. We have more vocal people and some people that are a little quiet. So we wanted to give the districts an opportunity to voice their concerns and what might be regional differences versus just hearing what works really well for one side of the nation versus the other. We're now starting the regional stakeholder meeting, so the roadshow starts next week. We've got Oklahoma City on Tuesday and Riverdale on Thursday. So we'll be providing some feedback after those and hopefully adjusting as we go. If we have new topics that are brought up at these meetings, we'll certainly roll those into what we're going to discuss or ask individuals to discuss. We also convened a state-federal working group. I think we have some members in the audience that are on this group. Based on our first call, I'm really impressed, and I think it's going to be a fabulous group. And wrapping it all up with a national ADT forum, hopefully in September of this year. These are the public meeting locations. Every date we start at 8 and go to 3 p.m. Again, I mentioned Oklahoma City and Riverdale are next week. We also have Nashville, Bloomington, Denver, Rancho Cordova in California, and Billings, Montana. We are looking at hosting 2 additional meetings. We just had to wait to make sure we had the funding for those, so waiting for confirmation for those this week, and then locations will be announced as they become available. So our goal for these meetings is kind of similar to what we did today, reviewing the current ADT framework. We're going to go through it pretty quickly. We don't want to spend a lot of time. We want to hear from industry, so we'll basically go over the basics to make sure people, who are there understand the basics of the rule and what we're assessing, how we're doing against. It's the current framework. It's not against full traceability. We'll have a stakeholder panel, so looking at representation from industry, so different producers, livestock markets, accredited vets, state veterinarians, maybe exporters in some states. And then there will be an open mic session after the stakeholder panel for people in the audience to have a chance to ask questions of the panel members. And they'll discuss what's been working well for them, what they think the gaps are, and that sort of thing, how we can move forward. And in the end of the day, we'll have breakout group discussions. Some of the topics are official identification, movement documents. Do we want to include beef, feed, or cattle? What are your thoughts in relation to that? And again, what should our short and long-term traceability goals be? The working group, as I mentioned, and we already had our first call, their objective is to evaluate gaps in the initial framework and provide options for advancing traceability in the future. We've asked them to either attend one of the regional meetings or as many as they can. We're also going to be providing a conference line for the Riverdale meeting for people to be able to call in. Due to the volume we're expecting, we won't probably be having comments or questions from that line, but it'll give people the chance to listen in and then provide comments via the internet, or they can write in comments if they have any. But hopefully the working group members will be able to listen in on that day and then attend as many regional meetings as they can, and they'll take all that feedback. We're also transcribing all the meetings, so they'll be able to take that feedback and kind of wrap that into their assessment of the comments that are made and their guidance for the national meeting in the fall. Just a quick snapshot of the working group members. So I know this is pretty hard to see, but we've got a really good group, and as I mentioned, I was really impressed with our calls, so I think it's just going to get better as we go and have some feedback from these meetings. Our national forum, again, will be to consider the feedback that we've obtained throughout the year. We've also asked, in addition to the regional meetings, and I know there's states that we don't cover in this road tour, and we apologize for that. It's impossible to have a meeting in every state, but we've really tried to impress upon our personnel there's no reason you cannot have a meeting in your state, whether you do the breakout discussions only, or you do a panel, whatever it is. We're providing them with all the materials we're going to go through at these meetings. We'll provide them with the feedback we get after the first few, and then take the conversation to your state. And even if you do have a regional meeting in your state, there's no reason it should stop after one day. Hopefully we'll get a lot of comments that are written in and discussion going and get some really good feedback. So again, the National Forum will bring everybody together to discuss approaches and solutions for the next phase. There will be a working group report, so we'll get a white paper out of the working group after they've had a chance to go over all the comments and provide an assessment to those. And again, we're looking at September of 2017. We'll provide more information for that as it becomes available.